Have you ever been to a place where every detail felt wrong, but you couldn't quite put your finger on why? Where the air felt heavier, every sound had a strange echo, and even the silence seemed to be watching you? Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to tell you now isn't just a Route 66 road trip story. It's an experience that forever changed the way I view cheap roadside motels. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night, a rest stop after hours of driving under a cloud-filled sky. My wife and I were exhausted just looking for a cheap place to sleep. Have you ever been there? That feeling that, in the middle of a long road trip, any bed will do, as long as you can close your eyes and wake up the next day. That's how we found the place. A flashing neon sign advertising rooms for under $40. It was cold, windy, and the rain was beginning to fall in thick drops, illuminated by the car's headlights. The parking lot was nearly empty, and each space seemed even darker than the last. But it was when we parked and got out of the car that I realized there was something in the air, a mix of dust, mold, and a metallic smell like oxidized iron that made me frown. The reception area looked like something out of an old movie, with peeling wallpaper and a weathered counter. Behind it, a thin, distant-looking man greeted us without asking any questions. He simply took our money, slid the key across the counter, and said, "Room 7B, good evening." That was it. Nothing more. As we walked down the narrow hallway, I could hear our own footsteps echoing strangely loudly, as if the building were empty. The doors around us had crooked numbers and worn handles, and many windows were covered by heavy curtains, tightly drawn. There were no other guests in sight. The room seemed adequate at first glance, simple but functional. A double bed with a faded bedspread, a lamp that cast a yellowish glow, and an oval mirror on the wall, angled toward the door. But it was there that I noticed something that made me uneasy. A thick metal chain, attached to the wall next to the door, had fallen to the floor as if it had been removed in a hurry. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you were alone? I felt it there. The atmosphere was tense, and the rain outside only heightened the feeling of isolation. That's when it all happened. A sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a loud bang that made my wife jump. The door, which had been barely ajar, slammed shut, and before I could react, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal sliding. The chain lifted on its own and closed on the latch, locking the door from the inside. My heart raced. The sound of my heartbeat seemed to blend with the rapid breathing that filled the room. I looked at my wife, and the fear in her eyes reflected what I felt. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because what happened next is the kind of thing that changes the way you look at any roadside motel. I stood there staring at that single locked door, trying to find some logical explanation for what had just happened. But deep down, I knew there was nothing normal about it. The silence that followed was even worse. There were no footsteps outside, no sound of chains moving. Nothing. Just that heaviness in the air, as if something invisible had just crossed the line between what is real and what is impossible. And that's exactly why I enjoy sharing these stories with you. Because in the end, it's not just about fear or mystery. It's about realizing that there are things that challenge us, that shake our certainties, and that make us question whether we truly know the world we live in. If this feeling resonates with you, or if you've ever experienced something that left you speechless, leave a comment. I read each one, and that's where many other stories come to life here on the channel. Yours could be the next one I share. And if you're feeling this connection right now, if you enjoy immersing yourself in these atmospheres filled with suspense and mystery, enjoy this video. It really helps keep this space alive and bring these stories to more people who also seek this kind of experience. Oh, and if this isn't your first time here, but you haven't subscribed yet, maybe now's the time. Your subscription shows me that it's worth continuing to bring you this kind of story. Here, each story is an invitation to explore the unknown with me. Now take a deep breath, because what came after that chained door was much more intense than I could have imagined. The road seemed endless that night. Route 66, which I had seen so often in movies and photographs, now stretched before me like an endless line winding through the arid Arizona desert. The horizon was tinged with heavy, deep gray clouds, heralding the approach of a storm. The wind cut through the cracks in the window, bringing a smell of dry earth mixed with the distant scent of rain. That scent that precedes something great. My wife and I had been driving for hours, and fatigue was beginning to weigh on our shoulders, making each mile slower. Signs for towns and small exits appeared and disappeared quickly, but none looked promising. With each mile, the sky grew darker, and lightning on the horizon briefly illuminated the outlines of the mountains, as if revealing something that would rather remain hidden. It was then that we spotted the old sign, illuminated by flickering lights. Desert Shadow Motel. Vacancy. The peeling paint and rust on the sign showed it had seen better days. But back then, all we wanted was a roof over our heads and a bed. We entered through the narrow driveway, the sound of gravel crunching under our tires. The parking lot was nearly empty. 2 dusty old cars sat near the side, looking as if they hadn't been moved in days. The facade was simple, a row of wooden doors, each with a hand-painted number, dimly lit by yellowed bulbs mounted on rusty brackets. In the corner, a bell hanging over the reception door swayed gently in the wind, emitting a soft tinkle that blended with the distant sound of thunder. Upon entering, we were greeted by a thin, middle-aged man with a watchful eye. The counter was small, made of worn wood, and behind it was a wall covered with keys hanging on numbered hooks. The smell of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant permeated the air. He asked us where we were going, and when I mentioned New Mexico, he made a brief comment. Long night to continue the journey. Better to rest here. His tone wasn't exactly friendly. It was more like an observation, or perhaps advice. We signed the registration, paid cash, and he handed us the key to room number 7, along with a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher at the time. Something between concern and disinterest. We went outside to get our bags, and at that moment I noticed the wind had picked up. The dry trees around the parking lot swayed, casting distorted shadows on the motel walls. The rain began to fall, heavy and rhythmic, turning the puddles on the ground into tiny mirrors shattered by the drops. Room 7 was at the end of the hallway. The door was dark wood, marked by scratches and chips that left the paint peeling. The number, held in place with 2 small nails, was crooked. I inserted the key into the lock, and with a sharp click, the door opened. The smell of mildew and something else, something metallic almost like rust, hit us immediately. Inside, the light came from a single lamp in the corner, creating pockets of shadow where the contours seemed to move with the light. The bed, covered with a worn beige bedspread, occupied the center of the room. The heavy curtains blocked most of the view of the road, letting in only a thin sliver of whitish light. The old television, propped up on a low piece of furniture, was off, but it looked like fingerprints had been left on the screen, as if someone had been leaning against it for a long time. My exhausted wife sat on the edge of the bed while I checked the window and door, more out of habit than suspicion. The wind whistled outside, and the sound of the storm grew louder, drowning out almost all other noise. It was then that I noticed something. On the side of the door, near the lock, were circular marks, as if chains had once been attached there. I didn't immediately think much of it, but an uneasy feeling began to grow in the back of my mind. It didn't just feel like wear and tear, it felt like recent use. As we tried to settle in that night, a series of small details began to add up, forming a picture I could never ignore. Things that, at the time, might have gone unnoticed, but that would later become crucial clues to understanding what was really happening in that motel. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The neon sign in front of the motel flickered erratically, as if struggling to stay lit against the wind blowing across the road. Half of the letters no longer illuminated, forming a broken word that, from a distance, gave off a sense of abandonment. The constant sound of electrical humming mixed with the occasional popping of light bulbs, creating an unsettling backdrop to the scene. In the parking lot, only a few cars were scattered about, all covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had bothered to move them in days. The rain, which was beginning to intensify, sent small rivulets of water running down the uneven asphalt, reflecting the flickering light of the sign. The building's facade was simple, painted a color that had probably once been vibrant, but was now lost in faded shades of beige and brown. The windows were covered by heavy drawn curtains blocking any view of the rooms. A worn awning, supported by rusted metal rods, covered the entrance to the reception area. Each gust of wind made the torn fabric move restlessly, as if trying to free itself. I pushed open the glass door and was greeted by the muffled sound of a bell hanging overhead. Inside, the musty smell was strong and immediate, mixed with something faintly sweet I couldn't quite identify. The carpet, a dark red from age and dirt, was sunken in spots as if it had kept the footprints of everyone who had ever passed through. The walls were covered in wallpaper with repetitive geometric patterns, faded and peeling at the edges. At the counter, a middle-aged man stared, intently at a random spot on the opposite wall. His posture was straight, but there was something in his gaze, a profound emptiness, almost as if he were physically there but his mind wandered elsewhere. He wore a dress shirt yellowed with age, the sleeves rolled up, and a black vest that looked like it had been part of a uniform many years ago. When our eyes met, he broke the silence with a deep, slow voice. "Good night." There was no question about names, destination, or reason for their stay. Just a slow movement toward the key panel on the wall. His hand passed through several hooks until he picked up a key with a heavy metal keychain engraved with the number 7. He placed it on the counter with a small clang, without making eye contact again. It was a mechanical gesture, as if he had repeated the movement so many times that it no longer required any thought. As my wife waited at the door, I noticed something else in the atmosphere of the place, as if time here had a different rhythm, slower, almost stagnant. The ticking of a wall clock in the corner of the reception area seemed louder than it should have been, each second marked with uncomfortable precision. I took the key and thanked him, but he only nodded slightly, returning his gaze to space. As I turned to leave, I noticed in the corner of the reception area a small bookshelf with a few forgotten objects. Old magazines with yellowed covers, a lamp without a bulb, a glass ashtray with long extinguished cigarette butts. It was as if this space were a silent repository of stories no one told anymore. When we stepped back into the rain, the cool air felt like an almost stark contrast to the stuffy atmosphere inside. The cold key in my hand felt heavier than it should have, and I couldn't explain why. As we walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, I noticed the lamps above the doors flickering slightly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls. It was as if each door guarded not only a physical space, but also something invisible and potentially unwanted. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because there was something about the way the place presented itself that felt more than simple neglect or decay. It was as if every detail, from the flickering neon to the receptionist's distant gaze, was carefully orchestrated to create a specific feeling, and that feeling wasn't welcome. It was something else, something denser, harder to name, but impossible to ignore. Comment there. I'm on this journey too. The rain fell harder as we walked down the outer corridor, each step making the damp concrete floor creak beneath our feet. The hollow sound of our shoes echoed, amplified by the absolute silence that reigned. The bedroom doors lined up in a row, but there was something unsettling about their appearance. All closed, with rusty locks and chipped paint. Some had barely legible numbers, as if time had erased part of the place's identity. It was then that I noticed the windows. They weren't simply covered by heavy curtains as I'd noticed on the facade. Many of them were literally sealed from the inside with crisscrossed planks, fixed in a makeshift but firm way. It was as if there had been a deliberate decision to prevent anyone from looking out or in. The wood, darkened by humidity, seemed to absorb the little light from the hallway, making those doors even more somber. My wife, who had been walking a few steps ahead, slowed. I watched as she shifted her gaze to one particular window where, through a small gap between the boards, there seemed to be a faint glow, almost as if a candle were burning inside. Before I could ask, a gust of wind blew, shaking the lamps above our heads. The flickering light made the glow disappear, or so I wanted to believe. The feeling of abandonment grew with each step. It wasn't just the physical appearance of the doors, or the absolute silence. It was an almost instinctive perception, as if we were passing through a space that didn't want to be disturbed. A corridor that seemed to stretch longer than it should, as if we were trapped in a repetitive sequence, where each door echoed the last. And there was another detail. Despite the parking lot containing a few cars, we heard no sound from inside the rooms. No television, no conversation, not even the rustling of curtains, just the sound of rain, the distant hum of the sign, and the rhythmic dripping from a clogged gutter. The absence of life was so striking it felt like a weight in the air. With each new door we passed, I felt as if we were being watched, not in an obvious way but a subtle perception, almost like the change in temperature when entering a room someone had recently been in. It was impossible to see any movement, but the instinct, the same one we've carried since primitive times to detect danger, was active. My wife quickened her pace and I followed suit, but before we reached the bedroom, we passed a door that made me pause for a second. I can't explain why, but the doorknob was more polished than the others, as if it had been used recently. The wear marks were obvious, and there seemed to be a faint metallic sheen even in the dim light. But what really bothered me was noticing that, just below, the wood of the door was scratched. Not like an accident, but with repeated deep marks, made by something, or someone, that insisted on damaging the material. I continued walking, trying not to show my discomfort. Room number 7 was at the end of the hallway. The key turned with difficulty in the lock, as if resisting the idea of being used. As I pushed the door open, the cold, dense air that came from inside hit me in the face. It wasn't just cold in temperature, but in sensation. A simple room, with bare walls and a faint metallic smell in the air. The bed was made, but the sheet felt rougher than it should have. The curtain was closed, and beneath it I noticed that the window was also boarded up. My wife looked around and made a low comment, almost as if she didn't want to be overheard by her surroundings. I didn't respond, but every detail seemed to reinforce the impression that this place wasn't just abandoned, but carefully sealed off from the outside world. Because it's precisely in these details that we realize that certain choices aren't the result of chance. When you start observing the signs, the boards, the silence, the marks on the doors, you understand that you're faced with a scenario that was shaped to convey something, to provoke a reaction. And often the impact isn't in what's shown, but in what's hidden. The room seemed frozen in time, as if trapped in a forgotten decade, immune to the changes of the outside world. The heavy curtains, a green darkened by time, let out only a thread of yellowish light that blended into the gloom. The lamp on the nightstand emitted a faint, almost timid glow, casting elongated shadows across the walls. The bedspread, once perhaps a vibrant red, was now a nondescript shade, faded and worn as if it had absorbed decades of silent history. It was impossible not to notice the oval mirror hanging on the opposite wall, slightly tilted toward the door. The position was no accident. That angle seemed intentional, as if designed to discreetly observe whoever entered or left. The glass had small stains and a slightly darkened tone, as if reflecting not only the image, but also a kind of memory of the room. As I approached, I noticed that, for some reason, the wooden frame was slightly shifted in one corner, revealing a tiny gap between it and the wall, enough to create the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But it was the chain that really caught my attention. Attached to the wall beside the door, it lay on the floor, thick and heavy, its link still gleaming in places despite the obvious rust. It wasn't just any chain. It looked sturdy enough to hold something much stronger than a simple door. My wife gave me a quick glance, a mix of confusion and alertness, and refrained from commenting, as if speaking about it aloud might somehow conjure up a meaning we'd rather ignore. The room's atmosphere had an almost physical density. It was as if the air were heavier, forcing each breath to be slightly deeper. Small details reinforced this impression. The soft creak of the floorboards with each step, the sensation that the temperature was slightly cooler than in the hallway, the smell, not just of mildew, but something metallic, subtle, that seemed to come and go like an olfactory whisper. We set our things on the chair by the window, and I noticed the seat fabric was torn in one spot, revealing old, yellowed foam. Beside it, a photo frame lay face down, as if someone had deliberately hidden the image. Without thinking much, I turned it around to look, but the photograph was already gone, leaving only the faded paper and the clear mark where it had been glued. The silence of the place was almost absolute, but something was off. Every now and then, a dull creak coming from some indeterminate point in the room interrupted the stillness. It wasn't the sound of wood shifting or the wind rustling the curtains. It was something more abrupt, as if an object had been slightly shifted and then returned to its place. My wife sat on the edge of the bed, testing the mattress, and made a small comment about how surprisingly firm it felt for something so old. I merely nodded, but my attention remained riveted to the mirror. From where I stood, I noticed that the reflection showed more than it should, capturing a portion of the wall that, theoretically, wasn't in direct view. It was a subtle detail, but enough to evoke that nagging feeling that we were being watched from a blind spot. The chain on the floor seemed almost out of place, yet at the same time the centerpiece of the room. I couldn't stop wondering why it was there, in that state. Had it been used recently? And if so, what for? The rust indicated age, but the shiny link suggested recent contact with someone's hands, or with something holding it together. I sat next to her and tried to mask my discomfort, talking about the trip, as if any mundane conversation would be enough to dispel the strangeness. But deep down I already knew this wasn't just any room. It wasn't just outdated or poorly maintained. It was as if every detail had been preserved with an intention we still don't understand. There are places that carry not only the weight of time, but also the energy of the decisions made within them. And sometimes this energy seeps into the walls, the objects, the air we breathe. It's the invisible sum of everything that's ever happened there, a silent record that needs no words to be felt. The bathroom door closed with a soft click, muffling the sound of the shower that began to echo shortly after. The water lapping against the tile created a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, contrasting with the eerie stillness of the rest of the room. I sank into the armchair against the wall, pointing the remote at the old TV, a heavy tube model with a thick bezel and buttons that creaked when pressed. As it turned on, a harsh hiss filled the room, and the image began to slowly form, with washed-out colors and a slight horizontal jitter that never quite disappeared. I flipped through the few available channels and noticed they were all local, short community programs, advertisements for local stores, a newscast with blurry angles, and hosts who seemed to speak in an almost personal tone, as if they knew everyone watching. On one, a middle-aged woman was announcing specials at a furniture store, but the audio was slightly delayed compared to the image, creating a barely perceptible discomfort. I paused for a few minutes on a channel showing an old soap opera, but the lines were muffled, as if recorded inside a closed box. Meanwhile, from the bathroom, the sound of water continued, interspersed with small metallic noises, perhaps the temperature being adjusted or the occasional tapping of the shower head against the shower head. The scent of soap began to mingle with the heavy air of the room, but still, the metallic odor I'd sensed earlier lingered, faint, almost like a reminder that this place wasn't easily masked. Just then, thunder crashed outside, so close it shook the window slightly. The sound was sharp and direct, followed by a brief flash that escaped through the gaps in the curtains. The lights in the room flickered, first with a gentle flicker, then with a quick less than a second blackout, before returning to their previous dim, steady state. The lamp beside the bed made a popping sound, as if the bulb were about to burn out, but it continued to work. The TV image distorted at the exact moment the thunder struck. The colors inverted for a moment, creating unrecognizable shapes on the screen, a humanoid blur that, for some reason, made me flinch slightly in my seat. When it returned to normal, the news anchor was reporting on an incident on the nearby highway, but the sound seemed lower, as if something had muffled the transmission. My attention was diverted by a subtle noise coming from somewhere down the hallway. It wasn't the sound of clear footsteps, but a gentle shuffling, as if something heavy was being moved slowly and deliberately across the floor. I tilted my head to listen better, but the noise died away almost immediately, leaving only the distant drip of the rain, which was beginning to intensify. I tried to ignore it, returning my eyes to the screen, but I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the TV's glass, I could see part of the oval mirror on the wall, and for a second, I had the impression of subtle movement there, as if something had flashed in front of it. When I turned to look directly at it, the mirror reflected only the room, empty, with the chain lying by the door. The adrenaline rush was instantaneous, but I took a deep breath and tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a reflection of the thunder or the TV. Still, I felt that latent tension creeping back in, like an invisible line pulling all my senses to their limit. The water in the bathroom stopped, and the sound of the shower glass sliding echoed. A few seconds later, my wife emerged, wrapped in a towel, her hair still dripping. She commented on how the water was strangely cold at the end, even though she hadn't touched the faucet. I simply nodded, not mentioning anything I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. She sat on the edge of the bed drying her hair while I sat in the armchair trying to hide my tension. On the TV, an advertisement began to play. It showed blurry images of a local restaurant, but the most disturbing thing was that the scenes looked very old, as if from another decade. The customers wore outdated clothing, and the narrator spoke in an almost monotone, announcing an address that sounded unfamiliar. The thunder echoed again, more distant, this time, but the light still flickered. One detail caught my attention. When they flickered, the mirror seemed to cast shadows that weren't there when the lighting was steady. They were elongated, blurred shapes, as if something were outside the frame, not in the reflection but in the space it implied. I felt the urge to get up and check, but I restrained myself. There was something in the atmosphere telling me not to attract attention. Instead, I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. The silence that fell was almost immediate, but not absolute. There was still that insistent dripping, the rain beating on the roof, and a muffled sound, perhaps coming from another room, like a distant murmur. My wife noticed me staring in the mirror and asked if I was okay. I said yes, just tired. But deep down I already knew it wasn't fatigue. It was the distinct feeling that something was watching us, and that the TV, the thunder, the rain, all of it was just serving as a backdrop to mask a presence that preferred to remain at the margins, on the edge of perception. Because there are times when what surrounds us seems to test the limits of our attention, almost as if there were an intention behind what we see, hear, or feel. Places like this have the power to shape our mindset without us realizing it, guiding our decisions in subtle, almost invisible ways. It's as if there's a hidden truth waiting to reveal itself, but only when we're immersed enough to be unable to retreat. The chain was exactly where I remembered it, lying on the floor attached to the wall by an old rusty hook. But now, for no apparent reason, it began to move. At first, a subtle, almost imperceptible sway, as if the floor had vibrated from a truck passing outside. But there was no engine sound, no traffic noise from the nearby road. The room was too quiet for that to be a coincidence. I watched, motionless, trying to find a logical explanation. But the movement didn't stop. On the contrary, the chain gained more rhythm, a measured metallic swaying, producing a light but sharp sound that echoed through the room like a whisper of iron. The sound didn't come from the chain alone. It seemed to spread through the walls, as if the metal were in tune with something greater, invisible. I stood up slowly, feeling as though any sudden step might shatter the fragile balance of the scene. My gaze drifted to the window. Still locked, the rusty latch at the same angle as before. No crack, no draft, nothing to justify it. I touched the glass with the back of my hand, cold as ice. A cold that didn't match the humid, muggy weather we'd experienced upon arriving at the motel. The swing of the chain slowed but didn't stop. I leaned forward to examine the hook embedded in the wall. It was thick, set into the old plaster, and around it small cracks spread like veins. The thought occurred to me that the piece might have been used to hold something, or someone. A thought I quickly tried to push away, but it came back with a vengeance when I realized that in the reflection of the metal, there was something that wasn't my face. It wasn't a clear shape, just a dark blur, distorted by the bending and wear of the steel, a figure that seemed to approach and recede, as if breathing along with the current. I blinked and it was gone. My wife, sitting on the bed, noticed my tense posture and asked what was wrong. I quickly replied that it was nothing, just something strange about the metal. But deep inside, I could already sense that it wasn't just strange. It was as if we were being carefully watched, and not for the first time. I slowly pulled away and sat back down in the chair. The chain stopped swinging the moment my eyes left it. It wasn't natural. It was as if the action depended on my attention, as if it knew when it was being noticed. Silence once again filled the room, but that silence wasn't empty. It was a heavy, dense silence, the kind that seems to carry a weight of its own. And it was at that moment that I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The chain, now motionless, was no longer in the same spot it had fallen from when we entered the room. It seemed to be a few inches further away from the wall. I knew I hadn't touched her, and my wife definitely hadn't come near me. Yet she was there, as if pulled. Instinct told us to get out of there, but curiosity spoke louder, and this is where the most dangerous part of our own mentality comes in. That almost irrational need to understand what's happening, even if it means putting ourselves in the center of danger. It's as if the brain, instead of protecting us, tries to convince us to stay, because the hidden truth seems more important than immediate safety. That chain wasn't just an old, forgotten object. It seemed to carry something, perhaps a story the place didn't want to tell clearly. And that's where the silent transformation begins. For those who allow themselves to be immersed in such environments, you stop simply observing and start participating even without realizing it. It's precisely in these seemingly banal details that the greatest revelations lie hidden. Places steeped in the past don't reveal their story all at once. They test your attention, provoke small reactions until you're so involved that you can no longer distinguish what's real from what's suggested. And at that moment, the decisions you make cease to be entirely yours. They begin to be guided by something hidden between the lines behind the scenes of what you see. The crack was so loud it seemed to cut through the air. I turned instantly and saw the door, which had been merely ajar, being wrenched open, slamming against the frame with an impact that vibrated the walls. The next sound was even more disturbing, the harsh scrape of metal against metal, as if a bar were sliding on its inner track. It took me no more than 2 seconds to realize the door had locked itself. I ran to it, my footsteps echoing on the worn floor, and grabbed the doorknob. I turned it hard. Nothing. It wasn't just locked. It felt like something on the other side was holding it. I pushed with my shoulder, trying to force the wood, but it was like pressing against a solid wall. My wife approached, her voice trembling as she asked if there was some kind of automatic lock. I replied with a look that said it all. There wasn't. That lock system was old, manual, without any mechanism that could activate itself. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a draft? But how, if the window was still closed and locked? I stared at the chain attached to the wall. Still, cold, as if nothing had happened before. It made me feel something strange. A nagging awareness that we were exactly where someone wanted us to be. And this feeling wasn't just about physical safety, it was about control. From that moment on, every detail of the room seemed more intense. The lampshade, which had previously emitted a dim, yellowish light, now seemed to cast longer shadows, stretching across the carpet until they touched my feet. The air was heavy, as if carrying an invisible humidity that seeped into my skin. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible, yet disturbing smell, a mix of damp wood and something metallic like old blood. I stepped away from the door and took a deep breath. It was as if my own mind was trying to grasp at any logical explanation, but with each passing second it became more difficult. And then comes the part few admit. When we're faced with something that defies logic, our mind doesn't just try to explain it, it tries to negotiate. You start thinking of absurd possibilities just to convince yourself you're still in control. And it was in that moment that I realized that perhaps the greatest danger wasn't what was outside the room, but what was taking hold inside my head. My wife suggested calling the front desk. I picked up the old-fashioned phone on the nightstand. The ringing of the spinning dial was slow, drawn out, and when I finally lifted the receiver to my ear, nothing, no sound, not even the characteristic hiss of old lines, just silence. I carefully replaced the receiver, as if any louder noise might trigger something I wasn't ready to face. Time seemed to have shifted in there. There was no way to tell if minutes or hours had passed since the door closed, and this sense of distortion is dangerous because it begins to affect your decisions. You stop thinking about what's best to do and start acting according to strange impulses, as if an invisible influence were shaping your next move. At one point, I realized I'd been staring at the oval mirror without realizing it. The reflection showed the room, the bed, my wife sitting on the edge, but there was something off about the way the light reflected. A shadow, subtle, hovered behind us but shapeless. I blinked, and it was gone. But that instant was enough for my body to react with a shiver that ran down my spine. That's when I understood that the closed door wasn't just a physical obstacle. It was a boundary. Outside, there was the normal, predictable world, where causes and effects made sense. Inside, we were entering a territory where the rules weren't ours. And once you cross that line, it's hard to go back to thinking the way you did before. This kind of situation isn't just about being trapped. It's about being confronted with a hidden truth, that no matter how much you believe you're in control, there's always something behind the scenes ready to take the reins. And when that happens, the impact goes far beyond momentary fear. It transforms your mindset, shakes your certainties, and forces you to look at a side of reality you might have preferred never to see. I pulled on the chain with all my strength. The cold, rough metal cut into my palm, and the sound of each pull echoed through the room as a cruel reminder that this wasn't just physical resistance. It was refusal. It was firm, as if someone had placed it there seconds before. But that was the most disturbing thing. There was no one there. I looked at my wife. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow, almost panting. She began to stand, pacing back and forth, as if the movement would dispel her panic. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the tension in the air made each word heavier. I told her I'd figure it out, that she didn't need to worry. But the truth was, my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was then that I heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured, echoing in the narrow hallway. The sound wasn't muffled like a guest's inattentive pace, but meticulous, calculated. It seemed as if each footfall was placed just right to be heard. I stared at the door as if I could see right through it. The distance between us and whatever was approaching was shrinking with each passing second. I grabbed the chain again and pulled again. Nothing. I felt the metal vibrate slightly, as if the force holding it was on the other side, just waiting for the right moment to react. My wife whispered that someone was coming. I already knew, and he didn't know what was worse: the actual presence of an unknown person, or the possibility that it wasn't a person at all. The footsteps stopped. Absolute silence. It was as if the hallway had swallowed all sign of life. I stood still, my ear close to the door, straining to catch the slightest sound. For a moment, I thought I heard slow, but deep, breathing on the other side. It wasn't the kind of breathing you'd expect from someone who was nervous or tired. It was calm, controlled, as if it were there by choice, not by chance. The psychological toll of this moment began to shift the dynamic between us. It wasn't just about escaping a room anymore. It was about understanding that we were participating, against our will, in something that had its own rules. This realization changes your mindset. You stop thinking in terms of right and wrong, and start asking yourself, what's the game here and what's my role in it? The air in the room felt thicker, as if we were breathing something other than oxygen. My temples throbbed, and a part of me began to consider things that, in another context, would seem irrational. Maybe if I spoke to whatever was on the other side, maybe it would show we were aware, but reason soon pulled me back. This wasn't a negotiation I wanted to begin. Suddenly, a faint scraping of metal against wood came from the lock. It wasn't the chain moving, it was something trying to manipulate it. My wife backed into the corner of the room, hugging her knees. Her expression said more than any words. I remained still, as if any gesture might precipitate something. The seconds passed and the sound ceased. Once again, silence. But this silence brought no relief. Instead, it became a minefield, where every heartbeat seemed too loud. And that's where the most treacherous part comes in. When the sound fades, you begin to hear what isn't there. You begin to sense presences in the shadows, movement in the corners of your vision, and even subtle changes in temperature. I was sweating, but I could feel the cool air on the back of my neck, as if someone were there. I turned slowly, and the room looked exactly the same, at least on the surface, but there was something about the way the light hit the walls, creating strange angles that shouldn't be there. The lampshade seemed to cast shadows that didn't match the objects. My wife began to murmur that she didn't want to stay there anymore, that we had to leave no matter what. I agreed, but the question was, how? Logic was no longer our ally. This was no longer a physical problem. It was something that required a different reading of the situation, one that involved instinct, perception, and perhaps accepting that we were dealing with something that didn't want to be understood. The pressure of being locked in, coupled with the sound of footsteps that could return at any moment, created a sense of distorted time. Each second stretched out as if it were a full minute. I knew that if this continued, our decisions would begin to be shaped not by clarity, but by fear. And fear, when manipulated well, can lead anyone to do exactly what someone or something wants. That's when I realized the greatest danger wasn't the closed door or the chain. It was what would happen if we accepted that situation as inevitable. Because the moment you mentally surrender, the rest is just a consequence. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this kind of experience shows how often we're placed in a seemingly inescapable scenario precisely to test how much lucidity we can maintain. It's not just about physical endurance, it's about resisting the narrative they try to impose on us, about recognizing that there are hidden truths, decisions that don't seem to be ours, and behind-the-scenes moments that never let us see the full script. Right there, I'm on this journey too. I approached the mirror with hesitant steps, as if each movement might alter what I was seeing. The surface was slightly fogged, perhaps from the contrast between the cold outside and the stifling heat inside, but it was enough to clearly reflect every detail. At first, my focus was on the frame, old, peeling, with small chips of paint revealing different layers of color, but soon my eyes shifted to what really mattered, the reflected image. In the mirror, the door was ajar, a crack wide enough to let in the dim light from the hallway, creating a pale rectangle that cut through the darkness. But what froze my blood was what occupied part of that space. A figure, still, motionless, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't a vague silhouette or a projected shadow. It was something solid, with clear contours, and it was staring straight into the room, at us. My heart raced, but I turned immediately to confirm. Reality hadn't changed. The door remained locked by the chain, firm, impassable. No beam of light, no visible corridor, no figure, just the opaque wood, with its ancient scratches, and the immovable lock. The contrast between what my eyes saw in the reflection and what they saw in real life was so stark that my brain took a while to process. My wife, noticing my change in expression, came closer. I asked her to look in the mirror, but I didn't tell her what she should see. She pressed her face close to mine, and I could tell by the tension in her body that she had identified the same presence. The air grew heavier. We didn't exchange words, but we knew that any sound could be permission for the reflection to cross another threshold. The figure didn't move. Its body seemed to absorb the dim light, creating an almost unnatural contrast. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes fixed, as if unblinking. It was the kind of gaze that not only observes, but measures, calculates, and decides. And there was something about the posture, shoulders slightly hunched forward, hands hidden from view, that conveyed intent. Instinctively, I touched the mirror's frame, as if I could feel a vibration coming from there. My fingers brushed the ice-cold glass, and for a brief moment I felt as if something on the other side had touched the same spot. An electric pulse shot through my arm, and I recoiled, but the reflection didn't change. The figure remained there, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. It was at that moment that I noticed a disturbing detail. In the reflection, the chain that locked the door was gone. The space was clear, as if it were just a matter of taking a step and entering. This difference between the two worlds, the reflected and the real, began to seep into my mind. I wasn't just seeing something impossible. I was being presented with an alternate version of what was happening at that moment. My wife began to ask, in a barely audible whisper, if we were going crazy. But I felt the opposite. We were more aware than ever. What the mirror showed seemed less like a delusion and more like a revelation, a hidden truth, something the room was trying to hide, but that silver surface, for some reason, refused to hide. And that's when I realized that ever since we'd entered that place, the mirror had been strategically positioned to reflect the door. It was as if it were part of a game, a necessary piece, so that at a certain point we could see what we shouldn't. I couldn't decide if it was a warning or a trap, but somehow I sensed the figure wanted me to understand that I wasn't trapped in the hallway. I was trapped in our perception. Time began to blur in the reflection. I couldn't tell if we'd been staring for seconds or minutes. At some point I thought I saw the figure's head tilt slightly to the side as if sizing up prey, and before I knew it, my breathing was in sync with hers, or at least with the rhythm I imagined I felt, coming from the other side. The most disturbing thing was that, despite everything, a part of me wanted to keep watching. It was as if there was a psychological magnetism to the scene, something that forced my attention to what might be hidden in the details, the slight flicker of light in the hallway, the blurred outline around the figure, the barely perceptible glint of something metallic near her hand. It was a mental journey that mixed fascination and repulsion, but the tension reached a breaking point when, in the reflection, the figure took a step into the room. The visual impact was like a punch, but when I turned toward the real door, nothing had changed. The space remained closed, silent, intact. The contrast between these two versions began to create a strange effect in my mind, as if I were torn between two places at once, unsure which was the real one. I felt like the mirror wasn't just showing me, but trying to pull me into its narrative. It was like a backstage portal, a place where the rules were different and where decisions carried real weight, even if made only in my imagination. With every passing second, I wondered, if that figure completely crossed the threshold in the reflection, would it change anything out there? Or had it already changed deep down and I just hadn't noticed? Moments like these show that reality is often not a solid block, but a fabric that can be bent, distorted, or even torn when certain conditions are aligned. Sometimes, what we see as a simple object, like an old mirror in a cheap roadside room, can actually be a window into a territory where logic loses its authority. We began pushing on the door with all our strength. The chain creaked, but didn't give way. Each impact echoed through the room as if we were slamming into a locked safe. My wife screamed as loud as she could, calling for help. but the sound seemed to die before it even reached the hallway, as if the walls absorbed every word. I screamed too, until my throat burned, but there was no response. No hurried footsteps coming toward us, no curious staff, no other guests opening the door to see what was happening. It was in this suffocating silence that the hallway lights began to flicker. At first, spasmodically, almost like a common electrical failure, but within seconds the rhythm became irregular, jittery until, with a final crack, everything outside was plunged into darkness. The small crack visible through the doorway now revealed nothing, only a deep black, as if the hallway had been swallowed by something. Inside the room, the change was immediate. The temperature plummeted, as if we'd opened a door to the harshest winter. Breath began to come out in white clouds, and the air became heavy, dense, and sharp. My hands felt like pure ice, and my fingers began to lose feeling. My wife hugged her arms, shivering, but not just from the cold. It was the kind of chill that starts on the skin and travels to the depths of the mind, mixing fear with something bordering on survival instinct. I looked around for some source of the chill, but there was nothing. No open windows, no noticeable draft. And yet, I felt as if something was breathing in the room, spreading that inhospitable temperature. It was unlike any thermal sensation I'd ever experienced. It seemed to have a personality, as if the cold itself had intentions. It was then that I noticed a very low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was the sound of plumbing, but there was an irregular rhythm like shuffling footstep or long, slow breaths. With each passing moment, they seemed to get closer, and there was no way to tell where they were coming from. It was as if the entire room were a single body, and we were trapped inside it. The mind starts to react strangely in situations like these. You try to rationalize. Tell yourself that everything has a logical explanation, that maybe it's just a blackout in the air, conditioning blasting. But at the same time, a more primitive part of the brain knows something is deeply wrong. It's the same part that, thousands of years ago, made our ancestors retreat from a predator in the forest, even without clearly seeing it. My wife looked at me wide-eyed as if about to say something, but stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze drifted to a spot in the corner of the room near the ceiling. I followed her gaze and saw a thin mist beginning to form there, swirling slowly, almost like smoke in slow motion. Gradually, it descended, spreading through the air. But unlike ordinary smoke, this one seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Wherever it passed, the room's lighting dimmed, as if being sucked into it. We tried to retreat to the opposite side, but the feeling of cold and oppression only grew. Our movements slowed, as if we were moving through icy water. Each step required effort, and my breath was already becoming shallow. I began to realize something wasn't right with time, too. I couldn't calculate how much had passed since the corridor went dark. Seconds? Minutes? Or something beyond that? It was at this point that a nagging question came to mind. Would anyone actually hear us, even if we could scream louder? Or were we somehow out of reach? Not just physically, but from all reality as we knew it. The fog continued to spread, but almost intentionally, as if it were surrounding us. The cold intensified, and with it came a strange feeling that we were being evaluated, not by a person, but by something unhurried, an invisible observer deciding the next step on this strange journey. With every passing second, I realized my decisions weren't so rational anymore. Part of me wanted to run to the door and keep knocking until the chain broke, even though that was impossible. Another part simply wanted to get away from the mirror, the door, the fog, as if hiding in a corner could avoid the inevitable. And there was a third, deeper part that wanted to understand. I wanted to see where this would lead, as if this were a revelation I couldn't abandon halfway through. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are times when the fight to survive isn't just physical. It's mentality, it's perception, it's how you decide to react to what you can't control. Sometimes, what's at stake isn't just the integrity of your body, but the preservation of your own sanity. Right there, I'm on this journey too. The chain fell, with a sharp snap, and the door, which had seemed welded to the wall, swung open on its own, creaking as if forced open from within. We stood there for a few seconds, just staring at the dark rectangle before us. The air outside didn't seem any colder than the air in the room, but there was something about it, an invisible weight, a strange density that made our skin crawl. I took the first step outside, feeling the hallway carpet beneath my feet. The lights, previously off, were now on, but they didn't illuminate as they should. It was as if each bulb emitted a dim, almost sickly glow that didn't dispel the shadows. I looked both ways and saw no one. No guests leaving their rooms, no staff milling about, not even the distant hum of televisions playing behind the doors. Just a solid silence so intense I could hear my own breathing echo. My wife approached, still trembling. We walked slowly, passing closed doors that felt heavier than ordinary wood. Some bore scratch marks, as if something had tried to get in or out. The hallway seemed longer than we remembered, as if it had stretched out during the time we'd been trapped. When we finally reached the reception area, the sensation worsened. The counter was empty. The receptionist's chair, pushed back, swiveled slowly as if someone had just hurriedly left it. Behind it, papers were scattered on the floor. An off-hook telephone emitted an intermittent buzz, and a wall clock showed an impossible time, not just because of the time, but because the hands were turning slowly, counterclockwise. We tried calling out, knocking on the counter, but no one answered. The glass door leading to the parking lot was ajar, and the breeze wafting through it carried a strange metallic smell mixed with a faint burning odor. We walked through the exit, and when we set foot on the asphalt, the impact was immediate. There wasn't a single car there, not even ours. The entire parking lot was empty except for the tire tracks scattered across the ground as if everyone had left at once. The wind cut through the open space, lifting small dry leaves and scraps of paper into the air. I looked around, trying to spot any movement, any distant figure, but the road leading to the motel was completely deserted. It was at that moment that I noticed something even more disturbing. There were no sounds of life around us, no engines, no insects, not even a bird's chirp, just the wind and the sound of our own racing hearts. The feeling of isolation was so intense that it felt like the world had contracted, leaving only that motel and the two of us inside. My wife held me tightly by the arm, as if trying to confirm that I was truly still there. Her breathing was rapid, and I could feel the same urge she felt, to get out of there as quickly as possible. But where to? The road before us seemed to stretch on forever, with no curves, no signs, no movement. It was then that I noticed a detail that, amidst my panic, had almost gone unnoticed: the motel's illuminated sign. It was lit, but it no longer displayed the name we'd seen when we arrived. Now, in distorted red letters, a message flashed that seemed to change every second, as if it weren't static. One moment I read, "No vacancy." The next, "Don't leave." I blinked, and the words changed again, but this time I couldn't make them out. Instinct told me to run, but something there demanded answers. This didn't just feel like an abandoned place. It was as if we were in the middle of a purpose-built set, and we were the main characters. And this realization that we might be living something that didn't fit the normal rules of reality spun my mind. Every step we took away from the room seemed to pull us deeper into a web, as if the motel were just the surface of something much deeper. And deep down, I knew any wrong decision there wouldn't just be about leaving or staying, but about what we'd find on the other side. Because certain places don't just hold stories, they shape those who enter them. There are decisions we can't undo, hidden truths that only reveal themselves when there's no turning back. Maybe it's not just about what happened here, but about why we were chosen to witness it. To this day, when I try to mentally revisit that night, it's as if the memories come in disjointed fragments, like loose pages from a diary someone hastily tore out. There's no clear logic to what we experienced, and perhaps it's precisely this lack of explanation that makes it all the more disturbing. It wasn't just the events, the door opening by itself, the distorted hallway, the abandoned reception area, but the constant feeling that something was watching us, silent, patient, as if it knew exactly what we were thinking. After that day, I never set foot in a cheap motel again, not just out of fear, but because of a different awareness, as if I had crossed an invisible line that shouldn't have been crossed. The road remains out there, inviting to those who see it from afar, but now I know there are stretches that don't belong to us, places that seem to exist in parallel, just waiting for someone distracted to stop and enter. Yet life goes on, ordinary days, ordinary routines, until sometimes the silence of dawn is interrupted by a memory I didn't ask for. A detail returns to mind, the metallic smell in the air, the muffled sound of footsteps that weren't mine, the reflection of something in the window that disappeared before I could focus. These flashes are like small reminders that certain stories don't end the moment we physically leave a place. They continue, finding gaps to infiltrate our present, as if to ensure we never forget. And there's one thing I've never admitted out loud. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like the chain is still there, not literally attached to the door, but present in another way, invisible, connecting that room to my life. It's as if, somehow, I never really left. And deep down, it makes me wonder, do we choose the stories we live, or do they choose us? I realized that what happened that night wasn't just an isolated event, but an experience that altered the way I perceive the world. It's about silent transformation, the kind that happens when a shock changes the way you see the ordinary. It's about small but crucial decisions like choosing where to stop for the night that can define the course of an entire journey. It's about the hidden truth that lies behind seemingly banal spaces, where the harmless facade conceals hidden behind the scenes we never imagined. The strangest thing is how certain places seem to hold energy, as if absorbing the emotions and fears of everyone who passes through them. Perhaps that's why some environments seem to carry an inexplicable weight, a burden felt even before anything happens. And this perception changes our mindset. We begin to pay attention to details we previously ignored, the way the lights flicker, the way the air seems denser, the way silence is interrupted at calculated intervals. The experience made me understand that fear isn't just about what we see, but about what we feel and can't translate. It shapes behaviors, decisions, and even how we relate to the space around us. After that night, I learned that it's not enough to rely solely on what's visible. There are layers that only reveal themselves to those who pay attention, and often being too attentive is an invitation to see what we can't forget. What about you? Have you ever experienced anything strange while traveling on the road? Tell me in the comments. Who knows? Maybe your story will be the next one here on the channel. If you've made it this far, I think you've already realized that this kind of story isn't just entertainment. It's almost like an invitation to see what most people prefer to ignore. That's why it's worth subscribing to the channel, because each story I share here carries a piece of this closer look, and I want to continue sharing it with you. Leave a comment with the phrase "I'm with you until the end," just so I know you've been through this entire journey with me. And if this video has managed to captivate you so far, it's because somewhere along the way we connected. So please leave a like, because it helps more than you can imagine to keep these stories alive here, and subscribe to the channel. Now, if you want to continue down this road, the next video awaits you. Another dark tale about a cheap roadside motel where the walls hold more than just memories.